Chapter 1. Solitary Beacon. My name is Ethan Harper, and at 25 I never thought I'd become the last lighthouse keeper on this rocky Maine coast. The job came with the old lighthouse, automated now, but still needing human hands for storms and tourists. It was my uncle's work, passed down like a rusted anchor after he died broke. I remember the day I first climbed those spiral stairs, each step echoing against stone walls that had weathered a century of storms. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before me, gray and indifferent, while behind me lay the small town where I'd grown up, where my mother still worked double shifts at the diner, where my father's calloused hands had built other people's dreams in the shipyard until his back gave out. We came from working stock, factory workers, waitresses, people who scraped by while the upper class in Portland sipped lattes and traded stocks. I'd watched my classmates leave for colleges I couldn't afford, their futures bright with possibility, while mine seemed as fixed as the lighthouse beam that swept the same path night after night. The lighthouse keeper's cottage was sparse. A kitchen with chipped linoleum, a living room with furniture that had seen better decades, and upstairs a bedroom that faced the endless sea. Uncle Frank had lived here alone for 30 years, and now it was mine. The solitude hit me like the first winter wind off the water, sharp and unforgiving. During those early weeks, I'd stand at the gallery deck, watching fishing boats bob in the distance. Some days wealthy yachts would cruise by, their white hulls gleaming, their passengers pointing at my lighthouse as if it were just another quaint New England postcard. I wondered what it felt like to live in that world, where lighthouses were charming diversions rather than inherited burdens. The automated light still functioned perfectly, casting its beam across the water every 10 seconds. But I maintained the old manual controls too, checking the lens, cleaning the windows, replacing bulbs when storms knocked the power out. It was steady work, honest work, but it paid just enough to cover the basics. Some nights, lying in that narrow bed, I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder if this was all there was, if I was destined to spend my life in Uncle Frank's shadow, tending his light, following his footsteps into obscurity. The town treated me with the same polite distance they'd shown him. I was the lighthouse keeper now, a fixture as reliable and unremarkable as the beacon itself. At Miller's General Store, old Mrs. Patterson would ask how the light was holding up, her voice carrying that tone people use when they're making conversation about the weather. The younger folks looked right through me, as if I'd already become part of the landscape. But in the evenings, when the tourist season ended and the last day trippers headed back to their comfortable lives, I'd sit on the rocks below the lighthouse and listen to the waves. There was something hypnotic about the rhythm, something that made me think about time and change and the strange turns life takes. Uncle Frank used to say the sea made equals of everyone, but I wasn't so sure about that. Some people sailed over it in luxury, while others, like us, were anchored to its edge, watching. Chapter 2. Echoes from the Past. 3 months into my tenure as keeper, a nor'easter battered the coast with the fury that only Maine winters can deliver. I'd weathered smaller storms, but this one tested every board and bolt of the old lighthouse. Wind howled through gaps I didn't know existed, and rain drummed against the windows with relentless intensity. It was during the cleanup afterward that I discovered the attic access panel, hidden behind a stack of Uncle Frank's old navigation charts. The ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed into the dusty space above, my flashlight beam cutting through decades of accumulated darkness. The attic held the usual detritus of a long life, boxes of yellowed photographs, broken furniture, coils of rope that hadn't been used since sailing ships ruled these waters. But tucked beneath a moth-eaten tarp, I found something that stopped me cold. A leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless hands. I carried it down to the kitchen and opened it carefully. The first page bore an inscription in elegant script: "The Private Observations of Elias Worthington, 1890 to 1892. Below that, in smaller letters, "Lighthouse Keeper, Pine Point Station." Lighthouse Keeper. This Elias Worthington had held the same position I now occupied more than a century ago. But as I read his entries, it became clear that our experiences couldn't have been more different. "Father has arranged for me to spend 2 years at the lighthouse," the first entry read. "He believes the isolation will provide excellent material for the novel I intend to write, and the sea air will strengthen my constitution before I begin my studies at Harvard." 2 years. A sabbatical. For me, this job was survival. For Elias, it had been an adventure. His writing revealed a world I could barely imagine. He described weekend yacht parties where Boston societals would anchor offshore, their laughter carrying across the water as servants prepared elaborate picnics on the beach. He wrote about correspondence with literary figures, about his father's shipping investments, about plans for a grand tour of Europe once his rustic interlude concluded. The lighthouse keeper's role is quite romantic when viewed from the proper perspective, one entry noted. "I find myself thinking of Thoreau at Walden or Byron's Solitary Wanderers. There is something noble in the simplicity, the communion with nature's grand forces." Noble. Simple. I set the journal aside and looked around my kitchen. At the dented kettle on the gas stove, the stack of bills held down by a chipped coffee mug, and the window where winter drafts whistled through gaps I couldn't afford to fix. Elias had played at being a lighthouse keeper the way children play house, knowing all along that real life waited for him elsewhere. But what struck me most wasn't his privilege, it was his certainty. Every page radiated confidence that the future held unlimited possibilities. He wrote about his plans with the casual assumption that doors would open, that opportunities would materialize, that success was simply a matter of time and proper breeding. "The sea makes philosophers of us all," he'd written in one particularly reflective passage. "Standing at this beacon, one cannot help but feel connected to something larger than oneself. I am but a temporary guardian of this ancient watch, part of an unbroken chain stretching back through generations." Temporary guardian. That phrase echoed in my mind as I sat in the gathering dusk, the lighthouse beam beginning its nightly rotation. Elias had seen his time here as a brief chapter in a larger story. For me, it felt like the whole book, a story that might end where it began, with Harper men tending other people's lights. I flipped through more pages, absorbing the details of a life I'd never live. Elias wrote about his tutors, his book collection, his plans for the family business. He mentioned donations to charity with the same casual tone others might use to discuss the weather. Money wasn't something he worried about. It was simply there, like air or sunlight, a constant that freed him to contemplate higher things. The journal's final entry was dated 2 years to the day after the first. "My tenure as lighthouse keeper concludes tomorrow. Father's ship arrives to transport me back to Boston, where real life awaits. I leave this place with profound gratitude for the lessons it has taught me about solitude, nature, and my own character. The next keeper will, I trust, find the same enrichment I have discovered in this noble calling." Noble calling. I closed the journal and walked to the window. The lighthouse beams swept across water that looked black under the cloudy sky. Somewhere out there, fishing boats were heading home after long days on the water, their crews tired and salt-stained, hoping the day's catch would cover the fuel and the mortgage payments and maybe leave enough for a decent meal. Elias had found enrichment here because he'd brought it with him: education, connections, financial security, a future mapped out in broad strokes. He'd been free to contemplate the philosophical implications of his isolation because he'd never really been isolated at all. His real world, his real life, had always been waiting for him just beyond the horizon. I couldn't stop thinking about Elias Worthington. His journal had awakened something restless in me, a dissatisfaction that went beyond the usual complaints about small paychecks and limited options. It wasn't just that his life had been easier, it was that he'd seen possibilities where I saw only walls. So I started writing my own journal, though I wasn't sure why at first. Maybe it was the long winter evenings when the wind howled and there was nothing to do but tend the light and wait for morning. Maybe it was the need to answer back to Elias across the decades, to offer a different perspective on the same job, the same isolation, the same endless sea. My first entries were angry, full of bitter observations about the unfairness of it all. I wrote about growing up in a house where every dollar mattered, where college was a luxury we couldn't afford, where following your dreams was advice that only made sense if you had a trust fund to fall back on. But gradually, something shifted in my writing. Instead of just cataloging grievances, I found myself thinking about solutions. If Elias could use this place as a launching pad for his ambitions, why couldn't I? The idea started small. I began researching lighthouses online, using the cottage's spotty internet connection to learn about maritime history, coastal tourism, preservation efforts. I discovered that several New England lighthouses had been converted into successful bed and breakfasts or educational centers. With the right vision and investment, my lighthouse could become something more than just a navigational aid. It could be a destination. The difference between Elias and me, I wrote in my journal one February night, isn't just money or family connections. It's that he never doubted he deserved success. He was raised to expect opportunities, to see obstacles as temporary inconveniences. I was raised to expect limitations, to be grateful for what little came my way. But recognizing the difference was the first step toward changing it. I started small, enrolling in an online business course using financial aid and what little savings I'd managed to accumulate. The coursework was challenging. I hadn't been in a classroom since high school, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in years, I felt my mind expanding, grappling with new concepts and possibilities. The Lighthouse provided the perfect case study. I analyzed its potential as a business venture, considering everything from startup costs to marketing strategies to regulatory requirements. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that it could work. The Maine coast drew millions of tourists every year, and authentic experiences were increasingly popular with travelers tired of generic hotels and attractions. My journal entries became more focused, more purposeful. I wrote detailed business plans, sketched out renovation ideas, calculated potential revenues. Where Elias had seen romantic isolation, I began to see opportunity. Tourism season here runs May through October. Peak months are July and August, when rooms at coastal inns can command $300 to $400 per night. A lighthouse bed and breakfast could easily charge premium rates for the unique experience. With 3 bedrooms in the keeper's cottage and the possibility of adding a guest cottage, we could accommodate 6 to 8 guests at capacity. The numbers were encouraging, but I knew the real challenges lay elsewhere. Financing would be nearly impossible without collateral or a strong credit history. Zoning approvals, historic preservation requirements, insurance, the bureaucratic hurdles alone could take years to navigate. And all of that assumed I could somehow acquire ownership of the lighthouse, which currently belongs to the Coast Guard and is leased to the town.
But for the first time since inheriting this job, I felt something beyond resignation. Each evening, as I maintained the light and watched the beam sweep across the water, I imagined a different future. Guests would gather on the gallery deck to watch the sunset. Children would climb the stairs with wide eyes, learning about maritime history and the brave men and women who'd kept these lights burning through countless storms. I began to see my situation not as a trap, but as a head start. While other aspiring entrepreneurs were looking for the perfect location, I was already here, learning the rhythms of the coast, understanding what visitors would want to experience. My working-class background, which had always felt like a disadvantage, suddenly seemed like an asset. I understood the value of $1, the importance of hard work, the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. Elias wrote about feeling connected to something larger than himself. He was right about that feeling, but wrong about what it meant. It's not about being part of some romantic tradition of lighthouse keepers. It's about having the courage to chart your own course, even when the waters are unfamiliar and the destination isn't guaranteed. Spring was still weeks away, but I could feel something changing, not just in the weather, but in myself. The journal that had started as a response to Elias Worthington was becoming something else, a blueprint for transformation, a record of dreams taking shape against all odds.
Chapter 4. Storm-Tested Resolve. April brought the kind of storm that reminded you why this coast had claimed so many ships over the centuries. I'd been tracking the weather reports for days, watching as a massive low-pressure system formed far out in the Atlantic and began its inexorable march toward shore. By evening, the wind was already gusting to 40 knots, and the seas were building into the kind of mountainous waves that turned even experienced fishermen pale. I'd secured everything that could be secured, double-checked the generator, and made sure the lighthouse's primary systems were functioning perfectly. When storms like this hit, the automated beacon became more than just a navigation aid. It was a lifeline. The power went out just after midnight, as I'd expected it would. The lighthouse's backup generator kicked in immediately, but within an hour, I could hear its rhythm becoming irregular. I grabbed my flashlight and rain gear and made my way to the generator shed, fighting against wind that seemed determined to push me off the rocky promontory. What I found wasn't encouraging. The generator was old, probably installed when my uncle first took the job, and the storm had exposed every weakness in its aging systems. Water had somehow found its way into the fuel line, and the electrical connections were corroding before my eyes in the salt spray. I had two choices: let the light go dark and hope no vessels were depending on it, or improvise a solution with whatever materials I had on hand. For Elias Worthington, this would never have been a dilemma. He would have called for professional help, or perhaps his father's connections would have ensured that top-quality equipment was always available. But I was 30 miles from the nearest electrical contractor, in the middle of a storm that had already downed power lines across 3 counties. So I did what Harper men had always done. I made do with what I had. The next few hours were a crash course in desperation engineering, using spare wire from my uncle's collection, electrical tape that was probably older than I was, and a prayer to whatever patron saint watches over lighthouse keepers. I managed to bypass the corroded connections and jury-rig a fuel filter from materials I found in the shed. The work was dangerous. Dealing with electrical systems in a metal building during a thunderstorm violated every safety protocol I'd ever learned. But with each gust of wind, I thought about the fishing boats that might be riding out the storm offshore, counting on my light to guide them safely to harbor. The responsibility felt heavier than the wind, more persistent than the driving rain. By 3 in the morning, I had the generator running again, its steady rhythm barely audible over the storm's fury. The lighthouse beam resumed its faithful rotation, cutting through sheets of rain and spray to paint its warning across the chaotic seas. I stood in the lantern room, soaked to the bone despite my rain gear, watching the light work its ancient magic. That's when I understood something that no amount of reading or planning could have taught me. Success wasn't just about having the right opportunities or connections or financial backing. It was about showing up when everything went wrong, about finding solutions when no obvious ones existed, about refusing to let circumstances dictate your limits. I thought about Elias again, imagining how he might have handled this crisis. Would he have risked electrocution to keep the light burning, or would he have accepted that some situations were beyond his control, confident that help would arrive eventually because it always had before? The storm raged for another 18 hours, but the lighthouse never failed. When the winds finally died and the sun broke through the clouds, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood, the deep satisfaction of a job well done against impossible odds. I'd kept the light burning not because someone told me to, or because it was the easy thing to do, but because it mattered. That evening, as I assessed the damage and made temporary repairs, I wrote in my journal with hands still sore from gripping tools in the wind. Tonight I learned the difference between privilege and power. Privilege is having advantages handed to you. Power is creating advantages from whatever materials you have at hand. Elias had privilege, connections, education, financial security. But standing here after keeping this light burning through the worst storm I've ever seen, I think I'm beginning to understand real power. The storm had tested more than just my technical skills. It had forced me to confront my own assumptions about what I was capable of, what I could accomplish with limited resources and unlimited determination. If I could keep a lighthouse functioning through a nor'easter with little more than determination and spare parts, what else might be possible? The business courses I'd been taking online suddenly seemed less theoretical. The plans I'd been sketching for transforming the lighthouse into a destination seemed less like fantasy and more like a logical next step. I'd proven to myself that I could handle crisis, could improvise solutions, could take responsibility for outcomes that mattered to other people. As I climbed the stairs to my small bedroom, exhausted but oddly energized, I realized that the storm had washed away more than just loose shingles and weak tree branches. It had cleared away my own doubts about whether someone like me, someone without connections or capital or inherited advantages, could build something meaningful from nothing but vision and effort. The lighthouse beam swept across calmer seas now, but its message felt different somehow. It wasn't just warning ships away from the rocks anymore. It was announcing that change was coming to this rocky coast, and that the last lighthouse keeper intended to light the way. Chapter 5: Foundations of a New Future. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late May, mixed in with the usual collection of bills and advertisements. I almost missed it. The envelope was thin and official-looking, the kind that usually contained bad news or demands for payment. But the return address made me pause. Northeastern University's College of Professional Studies. I'd applied for their online business degree program months earlier, during one of those late-night sessions when inspiration and insomnia converged over my laptop screen. The application fee had been a stretch, and I'd agonized over the personal statement, trying to explain why a lighthouse keeper with no college experience deserved a chance at higher education. My hands shook slightly as I tore open the envelope. "Dear Mr. Harper," it began, "we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into our Bachelor of Science in Business Administration program." I had to read the sentence 3 times before it sunk in. Accepted. They'd said yes. Despite my unconventional background, despite my lack of credentials, despite every reason they might have had to doubt my commitment or ability, they were offering me a chance. The letter outlined the details: course schedules, financial aid options, orientation requirements. The program was designed for working adults, with evening and weekend classes that could be completed entirely online. It would take 4 years,
assuming I maintained full-time enrollment. 4 years seemed like forever when I was standing in my uncle's kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his modest life, but I knew it was also nothing compared to the decades I'd already spent accepting limitations as unchangeable facts. I called the admissions office that afternoon, partly to confirm that the letter was real, and partly to hear another human being acknowledge that this was actually happening. The advisor I spoke with was encouraging, explaining how the program worked and what support services were available. When she asked about my goals, I surprised myself by describing my lighthouse preservation and tourism project with confidence, as if it were already a going concern rather than an uncertain dream. "That sounds like exactly the kind of innovative thinking we encourage in our students," she said. "Have you considered applying for our Small Business Development Certificate as well? It's designed for entrepreneurs who want to focus on practical application of their coursework." Entrepreneur. 6 months ago, I would have laughed at anyone who used that word to describe me. Now, it felt like a label I might actually deserve, or at least grow into. That evening, I climbed to the Lighthouse gallery and looked out over water that reflected the orange and pink of sunset. Fishing boats were heading home after a day on the water, their running lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. In a few hours, I'd start my shift maintaining the beacon, just as I had every night for the better part of a year. But everything felt different now. The routine tasks, checking the rotation mechanism, cleaning the lens, monitoring the automated systems, weren't just job duties anymore. They were part of a larger education, practical lessons in responsibility and reliability that no textbook could provide. I thought about Elias Worthington, and for the first time, I felt something approaching gratitude for his privileged perspective. His journal had forced me to articulate what I wanted to achieve, and more importantly, why I deserved to achieve it. If he could see opportunity in this isolated post, why couldn't I? If he could use this experience as a stepping stone to something greater, why shouldn't I? The difference was that his stepping stones had been provided by family wealth and social position, but mine would have to be carved from rock and determination. But maybe that made them stronger, more permanent, more truly mine. Over the following weeks, as I prepared for my first college courses, I threw myself into research with renewed energy. I studied successful lighthouse preservation projects from Cape Cod to the Pacific Northwest. I analyzed tourism trends and marketing strategies. I reached out to local officials about zoning regulations and historic preservation requirements. Each conversation, each bit of research, each small step forward felt like a revolution. I was no longer simply reacting to circumstances, I was actively shaping them. The lighthouse that once felt like a prison was becoming a laboratory, a place where I could test ideas and develop skills that would serve me regardless of where my path ultimately led. My journal entries from this period reflect a growing sense of purpose and possibility. 3 months ago, I was the guy who inherited his uncle's job and his uncle's limitations. Now I'm a college student with a business plan and the beginnings of real expertise in lighthouse operations and coastal tourism. The lighthouse hasn't changed, and neither has the sea, but I'm becoming someone different. Someone who sees challenges as projects rather than problems. Someone who asks, how can I make this work? Instead of, why won't this work? The transformation wasn't just mental. I found myself taking better care of the property, not just maintaining it, but improving it. I repaired shutters that had been broken for years, painted trim that hadn't seen fresh color since my uncle's early days. I started a small garden behind the cottage, partly for the satisfaction of growing something from seeds, and partly because I could envision future guests enjoying fresh herbs and vegetables with their breakfast. Each improvement was modest, funded from my small salary and whatever I could save by doing the work myself. But collectively, they represented something larger. A declaration that this place was worth investing in, that its future could be different from its past, that someone like me could be an agent of positive change rather than just a caretaker of decline. As summer approached and the first tourists began appearing on the coastal roads, I felt ready for whatever came next. I had a plan, I had the beginning of an education, and most importantly, I had proof that I could handle whatever challenges arose. The storm-tested lighthouse beam swept across waters that no longer seemed like barriers, but like pathways to possibilities I was just beginning to imagine.
Chapter 6. Illuminating Tomorrow. August brought the busiest tourist season anyone could remember. Day after day, cars with out-of-state license plates wound their way up the narrow road to the lighthouse. Families with cameras and curiosity, drawn by the romance of Maine's rugged coast. I'd gotten permission from the town to offer informal tours, and what started as a few extra dollars became something more significant, proof of concept for the larger vision taking shape in my mind. I watched these visitors with new eyes, seeing them not just as interruptions to my solitude, but as market research in action. They asked questions about the lighthouse's history, marveled at the view from the gallery deck, and frequently inquired about places to stay nearby. More than once, someone mentioned how wonderful it would be to spend a night in the keeper's cottage, to experience the romance of lighthouse life firsthand. My college coursework had begun in earnest, and I found myself applying classroom concepts to real-world observations. Marketing wasn't just theory anymore. It was understanding why people drove hours to stand where I stood every day. Customer service wasn't abstract principles. It was seeing the delight in a child's eyes when I explained how the lighthouse lens worked, or helping an elderly visitor navigate the steep stairs safely. One evening in late August, as I was updating my journal after a particularly busy day of tours, I realized I was no longer writing in response to Elias Worthington. His perspective had become just one voice among many, other lighthouse keepers whose stories I'd researched, successful entrepreneurs whose journeys I'd studied, professors whose lectures challenged me to think differently about business and opportunity. The lighthouse beam sweeps in the same pattern every night, but the landscape it illuminates is constantly changing. Ships come and go, storms reshape the coastline, and people like me discover that the view from here can be whatever we choose to make of it. That weekend brought an unexpected visitor, a woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Margaret Worthington Chen, great-granddaughter of Elias Worthington. She'd been researching her family history and had traced her great-grandfather's lighthouse experience to Pine Point Station. Did I know anything about his time here? I invited her in for coffee and showed her the journal I'd found. She read several passages with obvious emotion, then looked up at me with tears in her eyes. He wrote so beautifully about this place, but I don't think he understood how privileged his experience was. Reading this now, with everything I know about how different opportunities were then depending on your family background, I found myself defending Elias, which surprised us both. He was a product of his time and circumstances, I said, but he wasn't wrong about the lighthouse having something to teach. It just teaches different lessons to different people. Margaret spent the afternoon exploring the cottage and climbing the lighthouse stairs. Before she left, she made an offer that stunned me. Her family's foundation was interested in historic preservation projects, particularly ones that combined heritage tourism with educational opportunities. Would I be willing to submit a formal proposal for the lighthouse restoration and development project I'd described? 3 months later, I was sitting in a conference room in Portland,
presenting my business plan to a panel that included Margaret, 2 other Foundation board members, and a representative from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. The plan had evolved considerably from my early journal sketches. My college coursework had taught me to think more systematically about financing, operations, and risk management. The Lighthouse bed and breakfast concept remained the core of the proposal, but I'd expanded it to include educational programming, maritime heritage workshops, and partnerships with local schools and environmental organizations. The financial projections showed a sustainable operation that would preserve an important piece of coastal history while providing economic benefits to the surrounding community. Mr. Harper, one of the board members, said after I'd finished my presentation, "You've clearly put enormous thought into this project, but lighthouse preservation is notoriously challenging, and the hospitality industry is highly competitive. What makes you confident you can succeed where others might fail?" I thought about that question for a moment, remembering the storm that had tested both the lighthouse and my own resolve. The months of lonely evenings when I'd chosen study over easy entertainment. The gradual transformation from caretaker to entrepreneur. "I became new," I said finally, "because I've been doing it for 2 years. Maybe not at the scale I'm proposing, but I've been learning this place, understanding what it offers and what people want from it. I've been here through every season, every storm, every challenge that comes with maintaining a lighthouse on the Maine coast. I know what works and what doesn't, not from theory, but from experience." The Foundation approved a planning grant that would fund detailed architectural assessments, environmental impact studies, and market research. More importantly, they offered a pathway to larger funding if the preliminary work showed promise. I was still months away from breaking ground on any actual development, but I was no longer dreaming alone. I had partners who shared my vision and resources to make it reality. That evening, as I climbed the lighthouse stairs for what might be one of my last nights as simply a keeper rather than a developer, I carried both Elias's journal and my own. The lighthouse beam painted its familiar path across water that reflected stars and possibilities in equal measure. I opened both journals and began to write, not as a response to the past, but as a letter to the future. Tonight marks the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. 2 years ago, I inherited a job that seemed like a limitation, a reminder of all the doors that had never opened for someone like me. But standing here now, I understand that doors are less important than the courage to build your own. The lighthouse will keep turning, keep sending its signal across the water, but the message is different now. It's not just warning ships away from danger. It's announcing that change is possible, that people can rise above their circumstances, that the future belongs to those bold enough to imagine it and patient enough to build it step by step. Class doesn't have to be destiny. Background doesn't have to be limitation. Sometimes the most important light you'll ever tend is the one you kindle in yourself. I closed both journals and walked to the gallery windows. The lighthouse beam swept across water that stretched toward horizons I was finally ready to explore. Whatever came next, success or setback, triumph or trial, I would meet it not as someone trapped by circumstances, but as someone capable of transforming them. The last lighthouse keeper was becoming something new, and the light he tended was no longer just a beacon for ships at sea, but a symbol of what was possible when people refused to let their past define their future. In the distance, I could see the lights of fishing boats heading home, their day's work complete. My work was just beginning, but for the first time since inheriting this solitary post, I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal rotation, but now it illuminated not just the rocky coast of Maine, but the unlimited possibilities that waited beyond every horizon for anyone brave enough to chart their own course through uncharted waters.